Okay, we can begin. We're welcome. This is the Monday night LaRouche Pack strategic update. My name is Bruce Director, and we have with us tonight Tony Papper, who is going to give the strategic update. So, Tony, I just soon turn it right over to you so that you can set the stage for tonight's discussion.
Great. Was the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel the equivalent of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, which set in motion a train of events which inexorably triggered World War I just a few weeks later? The final trigger was the full Russian mobilization on July 30th, 1914, which in turn set in motion the Austro-Hungarian mobilization and the German mobilization, and a full European war was on, the biggest war in history at that point. On the evening of July 29th, Tsar Nicholas II, having agreed to a general mobilization, gets a telegram appealing to him to call off the mobilization. The telegram was from his third cousin. It was addressed to Nicky from his third cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm, in Berlin, and it was signed Will, begging him to call off the mobilization. So Nicky, or Tsar Nicholas II, rescinds his mobilization order on June 29th, saying, "I will not become responsible for a momentous slaughter." Less than 24 hours later, he gave the order a second time. The mobilization was on, followed, as I said, by the German and Austrian mobilizations, and World War I was in course, just about 4 weeks after that assassination. So that's the question. Are we in that form of countdown to war? A war which no government wants, but which they're inexorably being trapped into. The trap was sprung on October 7th. And one of the guys who pointed that out was the former French Prime Minister, Dominique de Villepin. Forgive my high school French, Villepin. He said in an interview on roughly October 29th, "Hamas has set a trap for us, and this trap is one of maximum horror, of maximum cruelty. And so there's risk of an escalation of militarism, of more military interventions." This was the same de Villepin, as some of you may remember, who in February 2003 appealed in the United Nations Security Council to stop the Dick Cheney rush for war with Iraq on similar grounds. He said then, in February 2003, about the projected Iraq invasion by George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and so on. He said, "Such intervention could have incalculable consequences for the stability of this scarred and fragile region. It would compound the sense of injustice, increase tensions, and risk paving the way for further conflicts." So de Villepin is today warning of the same thing, and justifiably so. We're in a far more serious moment even than that countdown of days toward the George W. Bush invasion of Iraq, which led to, everybody knows, it led to a decade of disaster in Iraq, but disaster throughout the whole region, waves of hundreds of thousands of immigrants to Europe. It plunged the world into chaos, which we're still in to a large extent. The recent article quoted an anonymous on this situation we're in of sliding into war. It quoted a senior Washington official saying, every country has a red line after which they'll act, but nobody knows what the other one's red lines are. Now, one aspect of this, only one aspect, is something we could call the paradox of deterrence. The US predominantly, but also other NATO countries, have a fleet of 73 ships in the area of the Middle East, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and nearby in the Indian Ocean. This is the US, Britain, France, Italy, and Spain. And there's some thousands of troops on some of these ships. As people probably know, it's 2 US aircraft carrier battle groups, other US ships. It was just announced that a Ohio-class nuclear submarine has entered the area. It's the biggest fleet in the area since that Iraq invasion of 2003, which I just recalled in another context. Now, what are all these? And there's also additional bombers flown into Turkey beyond all the air power that's available on that fleet. What are they all there for? Well, they're there to deter. Because, I mean, thanks to the people who disobeyed President Trump's orders when he was president, the US has 3,500 troops in Iraq and Syria in bases which are really indefensible. And elsewhere in the Mideast, a total of probably 20,000 troops in total. But we have troops scattered around there in indefensible bases in Iraq and Syria, which Trump ordered to be removed. And the Pentagon lied to him and defied him and betrayed their oath to the Constitution. So those troops are still there. They're sitting ducks. They're indefensible. And the Shiite militias of Iraq, of Lebanon, that is Hezbollah, and others, the Houthis in Yemen, are taking pot shots at these troop concentrations with missiles, an increasing number and frequency. And the reason for all these forces is deterrence, the threat of retaliation that this US base in Syria, like the one up in northeast Syria, it's really indefensible from these kinds of attacks. But the threat is, if you attack them, then you'll get the full force of the US fleet. So don't do it. But they're doing it. The Secretary Austin recently made a quite elaborate statement about how, yes, we've attacked these Shiite militia bases in Syria, I believe it was in that instance, but this is not connected to the Israel-Hamas conflict. We're only doing it to protect our troops, and if they stop, we'll stop. So, it's all very nice, but they didn't stop. They're continuing. So what's going to happen? I mean, the head of the huge Shiite militia in Lebanon, Hezbollah, head of its name Nasrallah, he gave a long-awaited speech last Friday, first speech he's given since October 7th. And in that speech, he made it clear Hezbollah, which has very large forces, said to have over 100,000 missiles, tens of thousands of them very accurate, and I believe, many thousands of troops. I can't give you a number. He said that Hezbollah wasn't entering the war at the moment. That would depend on what happened in Gaza. But he said about the US threat, you're threatening us with your ships and your aircraft. We're going to go ahead anyway. We're not going to be deterred. And they haven't been deterred. So what are we looking at there? rather than deterrence, we're looking for a spiral into war. The paradox of deterrence is that this deterrence is not deterring. It's leading toward war. It's only one of many avenues that's leading toward war. I mean, people are aware, I'm sure, that Biden has given a war powers notification to Congress under the War Powers Act, required when U.S. troops go into hostile action and supposed to be ratified by Congress within a period of days. So we're already there. And that paradox of deterrence, or that spiral from deterrence into full war, is only one aspect of the way in which we're sliding toward war. I mean, the other aspect, which is maybe more obvious to people, is that 10,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza. Roughly 4,000 of them are children. Pictures of these children are circulating all over the world. They're circulating in every Muslim country. And the place is on fire. I mean, the world is on fire. So the Muslim world is on fire from one end of the world to the other, Shiite, Sunnite, whatever. As I said, I mean, the governments don't want war. None of them. I mean, Iran doesn't want war, Syria, Lebanon. Nobody wants war. But there's a pressure of enraged masses, which is capable of toppling the governments. I mean, Jordan's population is mostly Palestinian, not Jordanian. So what does this mean to Jordan? What does it mean for the stability of the government? So, I mean, that's the major figure. That's the major avenue on which we're sliding into war. And sliding closer, the longer the war in Gaza goes on, because it's a war which is killing so many civilians. And to approach this correctly, people have to realize that a lot has changed over the past decade, and even more over the period, the 20 years since that Bush invasion of Iraq. Really, everything is different. I mean, one of the things you've got to understand is that the massive military preponderance of the U.S., which many of us have come to be accustomed to as a fact of life our entire lives, as I have, this doesn't exist any longer in that form. There is not that massive military predominance. And the countries, for instance, in the Middle East, which maybe you're used to thinking of as, joke countries or not really countries, they have military power, many of them. Some of them, a lot of it. Iran has a lot. Turkey has a lot. These are well-armed modern states. They're not backward countries like most of the countries the U.S. has fought wars in over the past half century. I mean, just one thing to try to, as an example of that loss of relative military power, look at Ukraine. I mean, after 2 years, the Ukraine war, or a bit more than 2 years, the Ukraine war has been lost. There's no denying it. But what has been defeated in Ukraine? The Ukrainian army, which was a very well-trained army, and a very capable army, but it's an army that used U.S. doctrine, U.S. training, U.S. weapons, U.S. intelligence. U.S. doctrine, U.S. training, U.S. weapons, U.S. intelligence. That's what failed in Ukraine. That was defeated by Russia. Which the wise men of our foreign policy elite said was a failing power on the way out. In fact, I mean, if you remember back to early 2022 and the end of 2021, the geniuses of the incoming Biden administration told us that Russia would be destroyed by economic sanctions without need for U.S. training, doctrine, U.S. arms. And the fact is, Russia is economically stronger than it was at the start of the war. It's militarily stronger, and the war has been lost. But it's the U.S. in the sense in which I said it. It's the U.S. which has lost the war. Look at the Mideast theater with, as I said, 73 U.S., British, French, 73 NATO ships and submarines clustered around there. A few days ago, Putin began MiG-31 flights, patrols, over the Black Sea with MiG-31s armed with Kinjal missiles. These are hypersonic, maneuverable, air-launched ballistic missiles. The U.S. doesn't have anything like this. And more important, we have no defense against it, nor does anybody else. Once they're launched, there's no way to stop them. Those 73 ships are all sitting ducks to be taken out by Kinjal missiles with no defense if Russia were to enter a war, which I'm not saying they're going to. I'm just trying to illustrate, I don't think they are, but certainly not anywhere near now. But I'm just trying to illustrate that the all-powerful U.S. military, which we've been accustomed to for so many years, is just not true. Now, there's been tremendous changes in the U.S. population, and there's massive changes visible in the psychology or the mentality of populations all over the world. I mean, and, you know, everything that's going on in European, I spoke about Muslim countries. I mean, Muslim countries are rallying masses of people with these photos of the dead children in Gaza in a way which has never before been seen. In Europe, and there's massive demonstrations. In the United States, there's massive demonstrations, among other things, for ceasefire. London, maybe a week ago, had the largest demonstration in its history. And you can see videos of this. It's incredibly large crowds. Again, I can't say the details. They're demonstrating in some way or other against the Gaza war. Now, I mean, the U.S. relationship to Israel, it used to be, not that long ago, that we had the Zionist lobby, which comprised, you know, AIPAC, the ADL, and we had the Christian Zionist sects or denominations who believe, I mean, they still exist, who believe that their salvation or their rapture depends on a battle which Israel will fight for Jerusalem, and a whole complicated reading of the revelations of St. John the Divine, which, you know, brought these people in as committed Zionists, even though they were Christians rather than Jews. Now, these denominations and all this still exist. AIPAC still exists. The ADL still exists, but their power is nothing compared to what it was. Everything has changed. I mean, the ADL has been widely discredited. Elon Musk says he's suing them for calling him an anti-Semite. So that has changed. I mean, a survey, I believe it was, can't remember the agency. I can't remember the agency that took it, but a survey over the past 10 days, and I don't believe all surveys, but this was very interesting to me. A survey over the past 10 days of American voters said that 84% of them fear a widening war in the Middle East. 84%. 51% think the U.S. should send help to Israel. So that's a majority, but rather narrow majority. 74% think the U.S. should send aid to help Palestinian civilians. So this is not the profile of the American population, which we're used to, certainly which I'm used to. It's totally new. And obviously, the MAGA movement, which is making tremendous gains to the point where, for the first time ever, Donald Trump is clearly leading in surveys, where he won the 2016 election when he was failing in the surveys, so in the polls. So he's now leading in the polls, which is a huge change. So we're dealing within this changed world. Now, we've got to get a ceasefire in Gaza before it's too late. I mean, there's no way, short of a ceasefire, there's no way to halt the slide into war. So it just has to be done. I mean, if you value your country and your descendants, including the unborn ones, you've got to be on the phone with your congressman, your senator, Democrat or Republican, no difference, and call the White House. There have to be a ceasefire. That would at least put a temporary stop to the contagion. Now, we've got to move forward from that to settle the Palestinian question with a two-state solution. Does the Biden administration have the brains to do that? They probably don't. But the brains of the population, the newly gained brains of the American population, they have a lot more brains than they ever have, in my experience, has got to somehow substitute for the brains which are not there in this administration and move toward a solution of the crisis in conjunction with Russia, very importantly. China could be of help, and others. I mean, Europeans want to help in this, but Russia especially can be of help. The President Trump had built up during his administration the Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between Israel and a number of the leading Arab countries. And he had set up an agreement for a Palestinian two-state solution on the basis, very importantly, that they had lined up, Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and others working on it, had lined up $50 billion in investment funds, mostly private, to create infrastructure and modern jobs in Palestine, from the U.S., but very importantly, from all kinds of sources in the Mideast. So he had set up the basis for pursuing to a solution of the crisis in his second term. But, he denied that second term. And during the transition, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who had been his big agent for the Mideast, met with the incoming administration, met with Sullivan, and said to him, what you should do is keep pushing the Abraham Accords and keep pushing the two-state solution on the Palestinians. And, eventually you'll get it. You'll get there. But the Biden administration thought they knew better. And we see what has happened. I mean, an important part of what has happened, and Bruce, I think, will have more to say about this, is that the starting point for Trump's Abraham Accords, and we discussed this in previous Monday night updates, the starting point for his Abraham Accords was his first foreign trip, which was to Saudi Arabia, where he set up an alliance of the Arab states against terrorism. And this was extremely important and extremely effective. But Biden, again, thought he knew better and let that lapse. And when Trump says, October 7th would never happen if he were president. Probably what he means is that the alliance he had set up against terrorism would have thwarted that and prevented it. And indeed, as people probably know, Egyptian intelligence telephoned Bibi Netanyahu a few days before the October 7th attack and warned him about it. So, I mean, that shows the potential of an alliance against terrorism, which included Egypt, Saudi Arabia, many other states, which President Trump had set up. So that's what I had to say for now, and I'd like to pass it to Bruce.
Well, let me just say a couple things, and then we should jump right into questions, because I think this is something that really has to be thought through, and it requires a change in thinking and giving up a lot of the preconceptions that one might have, which is exactly what Trump did in the Abraham Accords. As I think Barbara told us a few weeks ago in her presentation, she recounted the discussion between the recent interview with Jared Kushner, and he said that he had established some basis to have open relations with Saudi Arabia, and both Tillerson and Mattis were in the Oval Office with him, and they said none of this will work. The Saudis will never keep their word. This won't work. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know anything. We're the experts. And this was in preparation for a phone call between President Trump and the King of Saudi Arabia. And he said, when they got on the phone, he laid out Jared's proposal to the king, and the king said, yes, we'll do it. And who should we work with? And the king of Saudi Arabia said, work with my son, the crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. And Trump said, okay, we'll tell him that he should work with Kushner. So Trump went around the experts. And that's the kind of thing that obviously was extremely important for world history, but it also has to be the kind of thinking that we as citizens of the United States have to learn to do, because otherwise we'll get caught in a trap. Now, this is precisely what didn't happen in World War I, as Tony said. The reason why they were Tsar Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm were cousins was because they were both related to Queen Victoria, as most of the royal families in Europe were at the time, Queen Victoria of England. And it was the British who had nothing to gain from a national standpoint, but everything to gain as an imperial standpoint, of ratcheting up the tensions in order to set about this war, because what the British Empire was trying to do was to prevent any type of alliance between Russia and Germany and the United States, which would have opened up or excluded the British from being able to conduct manipulations throughout Asia, and especially in Southwest Asia, which and there's a lot of other factors involved here, but that's sort of the general view or the general picture. So it was the British Empire and the requirements of the British imperial factor which superseded all national interests. And so every country that went to war in World War I did it against their own national interests. And as LaRouche often pointed out, this didn't begin in 1914, but it actually goes back to the British instigated firing of Bismarck, who was the the Chancellor of Germany earlier, and who had been committed to trying to forge a relationship between Russia, the United States, and Germany against the British Empire. Britain would have had the opportunity to drop their imperial requirements and join in that effort as a nation state, but that didn't happen. The British imperial interest prevailed. And this is really what's going on right now, that we are reaping the horror that has been sown, especially over the last 50, 60 years, by the United States putting our muscle against our national interests behind the British policy in Asia, which was to prevent collaboration between the United States and Russia, and Europe and Russia, and secondarily China, for economic development of the continental powers. Because the United States, Russia, China, Germany, and even India, to a large extent, are continental nations, and understand the importance of developing the continents. And as LaRouche has pointed out, when you look at the Middle East, you see that it's in a crucial place, not necessarily just because of oil, but because it is the crossroads between three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. Now, since in this policy of using Muslim fundamentalism or the Muslim Brotherhood or these other groups to foment instability, was developed by the British, especially during the 19th century, as part of what was known as the Great Game. And they continued this into the 20th century, and without going through a big, long history, it was the British policy, which is to play one side off the other, foment ethnic rivalries, tribal rivalries, terrorism, and so forth, to basically prevent the development of nation states in this area. And this went on until, with Roosevelt taking the opportunity that was afforded the United States during and World War II, where the U.S. became the predominant military power and political power, to forge a different approach. He had the famous meeting with King Saud of Saudi Arabia and offered an American alliance, an American policy in the Middle East. Well, of course, Roosevelt died, and the British then took over the policy, or reestablished their policy, and the U.S., basically, with the exception of what Trump did with the Abraham Accords, for that period onward, continued to put our muscle behind Anglo-American policy, British policy. And that's what is developing here. And the other point to underscore is that this has been a complete failure, even from their own standpoint. I guess if the standpoint is to create chaos and ungovernability, you could say that it succeeded. But just look back over the last 50 years. The Kissinger policy failed. The Brzezinski policy of using Islamic fundamentalism and funding terrorism and the Mujahideen and so forth, to try and use that as against the then Soviet Union, failed. The policy of the United States to overthrow the Shah of Iran and put in Khomeini, and the British policy, failed. The Bush 1 policy, and even in the Reagan administration, where the United States funded both Saddam Hussein and the Iranians and gave weapons to both sides during the Iran-Iraq war, with the British idea, let the two sides fight each other out and kill each other, in which millions of people were killed in that horrific war, which was failed. Where did it get us? What did it produce? Nothing but disaster. Then you had the Clinton policy, which was basically a continuation of the Bush 1 policy. And then you had Bush 2. And after 9/11, as I mentioned last week and in other presentations, the ostensible thing we had to do was to stop terrorism. And the countries that provided the most assistance to the United States, military assistance, intelligence, collaboration, and so forth, were Russia, Iran, Syria, and Libya. And this collaboration was quickly undermined, and all these wars in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Syria, the war in Libya, all were based on going back to this British policy of trying to use terrorism as a means of geopolitical control. And it all failed. And the people who are in the Biden administration, who are trying to implement this policy right now, which has clearly failed, are the very same people: Blinken, Sullivan, Nuland, Biden, and so forth. So you have a contrast here, a clear contrast between at least a half century of complete failures, which have set one fire after another, leading to ever greater horrific wars and terrorism. And on the other side, you have an opportunity, a hopeful opportunity, created by what Trump did by rejecting this policy and creating an America First approach, as Roosevelt attempted, towards the Middle East, which completely went against what all the failures said could never happen. So I've left out a huge amount of things that go into that discussion and the history there. But I just think that it's important to realize that what is happening in the world right now, and what the key to resolving this crisis, or turning it around and getting it in a different direction, is being able to change the way we're thinking. Trump demonstrated that worked. And now we've got another year and a little more before Trump is going to be reelected and take office again. So what do we do between now and then? Well, we have to be the voice. That is, the American people have to increasingly be the voice that insists that the failed policies be rejected. And these policies, the new way of thinking, has to be the direction that has to be the U.S. policy. Stop trying to play games here and put our pressure on Congress to articulate that this is the kind of policy which has to be implemented. And I think if we enable ourselves to think in a different way, then I think the world will start to see that the U.S. is changing its policy, and there's hope as opposed to despair.